Hi, everybody. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. I want to start reading a book to you, and then we're going to answer some questions about that book after I finish each chapter or maybe each portion of a chapter. So, the book I've chosen for me to read to you is called Old Yeller. It is a 910 Lexile level, and I want you to listen to it as I read part of it, and I'll try to read some periodically and upload them on Canvas. And then you'll know how to answer the questions. So here we go. Chapter 1, Old Yeller. We called him Old Yeller. The name had a sort of double meaning. One part meant that his short hair was a dingy yellow, a color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound that he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. I remember like yesterday how he strayed in out of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so fast at first that I wanted to kill him. And then later when I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot some of my own folks. That's how much I'd come to think of the big yeller dog. He came in the late 1860s, the best I remember, and anyhow, it was the year that Papa and a bunch of other Salt Lick settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steers that trailed them to the new cattle market in Abilene, Kansas. This was to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those years right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country and a good one. As Papa pointed out the day the men talked over making the drive, we had plenty of grass, wood, and water. We had the wild game for killing and fertile ground for growing bread. And the Indians had been put onto reservations with the return of the U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Papa wound up, all we lack is a tight tail hold on the world is having a little cash money. And we can get that in Abilene. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Abilene was better than 600 miles north of the Texas Hill Country we lived in. It would take months for the men to make the drive and ride back home. And all that time, the womenfolk and children of Salt Licks would be left in the wild frontier settlement to make out the best that they could. Still, they needed money. And they realized that whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it over with each other and with their women and decided that it was the thing to do. And they told their folks what to do in case the Indians came off the reservation, or the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. And then they gathered their cattle and burned the trail brand on their hips and pulled out on a long trail to Kansas. I remember how it was the day Papa left. I remember his standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his gun in a scabbard, and his bedroll tied on the back of a cantle. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked with his high-crowned hat and his black mustaches drooping and the cow-horn curves past the corners of his mouth. And I remembered how Mama was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how little Arliss, who was only 5 and didn't know much, wasn't trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off, not because Papa was leaving, but because he couldn't go too. I was about to cry. I was 14 years old and pretty near a grown man. I stood back and didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. Papa got up, loving on Mama and little Arliss, and mounted his horse. I looked at him. He motioned for me to come along, and so I walked beside his horse down the trail that led up the big live oaks past the spring. When he'd gotten out of hearing of the house, Papa reached down and put a hand on my shoulders. "Now, Travis," he said, "you're getting to be a big boy, and while I'm gone, you'll be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Mama and little Arliss, And you look after the work and don't wait around for your mama to point out what needs to be done. You think you can do that?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Now, there's the cows to milk and the wood to cut and young pigs to mark and fresh meat to shoot. But there's mainly the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the varmints eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread for the winter." "Yes, sir," I said. "All right, boy. I'll be seeing you this fall." And I stood there to let him ride on, and there wasn't anything more to say. Suddenly, I remembered and went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted around in the saddle. "Yeah, boy?" he said. "What is it?" "That horse," I said. "What horse?" He said like he'd never heard me mention it before. "You mean you're wanting a horse?" "Now, Papa," I complained, "you know I've been aching for a horse to ride. I've told you time and time again." I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I hadn't realized that he was just teasing. "Well, what you're needing worse than a horse is a good dog." "Yes, sir, but a horse is what I'm wanting worse." "All right," he said. "You act a man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see that you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. I think we can shake on that deal." And he reached out his hand and we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man, and it made me feel big and solemn and important in a way I'd never felt before. I knew then that I could handle whatever needed to be done while Papa was gone.